No one in the studio expected what would happen next. The cameras rolled, the audience leaned forward, and the air crackled with anticipation as Donald Trump stepped forward, his gaze locked on the two TV hosts who had dared to mock his son. His voice, calm but firm, carried unshakable resolve. What he said next would leave everyone in the room stunned and set in motion a chain of events no one could stop. The bright lights of the Spotlight Hour studio gleamed against the black backdrop. At the center of the stage sat the evening's hosts, Rachel Connor and Mark Sullivan, two of the most recognizable faces in political media. Their sharp wit and no-holds-barred approach had made them household names, but tonight their words would spark a firestorm neither of them could control. "All right, folks," Rachel began, her smile thin with amusement. "Let's talk about the Trump family. Because honestly, how can we not?" The audience chuckled. "Exactly," Mark added. "I mean, we've got Donald Trump making headlines again, but let's not forget the next generation of the Trump dynasty. Barron Trump, anyone?" Rachel smirked. "Oh, you mean the kid growing up in a golden tower while the rest of us are just trying to pay rent? Must be rough." Some audience members laughed, though a few glances shifted awkwardly. "Come on," Mark said, leaning forward. "Imagine being Barron, waking up every morning to your dad's tweets. That's got to be character building, right?" Rachel chuckled. "Poor kid probably doesn't know the difference between a playground and a golf course. Guess we'll see if he inherits the family business of, well, losing elections." The laughter hit harder, sharper. "And let's not forget the pressure," Mark added. "Imagine having to live up to the family legacy. 1 minute you're learning to tie a tie, the next you're expected to run an empire. No pressure, right?" Rachel tapped her chin. "Yeah, but at least he's got a fallback plan. If all else fails, there's always reality TV. Keeping Up with the Trumps, coming soon to a network near you." Mark clapped his hands. "And if that doesn't work, politics is always an option. After all, with a name like Trump, who needs experience?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, louder and more confident now. But beneath the noise, something shifted. And though neither host knew it, their words had already set events in motion. Later that night, inside Trump Tower, Donald Trump stood by the window, phone in hand. He had watched the clip twice, once to confirm what he'd heard, and again to be sure his anger didn't cloud his judgment. "They crossed the line," he said, setting the phone down. Across from him, Charles Whitmore, his lead attorney, nodded. "We have several options. A statement, a cease and desist?" "No," Trump interrupted. "This isn't about statements. They mocked my son. Barron stayed out of the spotlight. This wasn't criticism. It was personal." "A lawsuit will draw attention," Whitmore warned. "Good. Let them see that words have consequences." Whitmore studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll begin drafting the lawsuit, defamation and emotional distress. I'll make it airtight." Trump's gaze didn't waver. "Make sure they know. This isn't about money. It's about respect." 3 days later, in a glass-walled conference room, Rachel Connor and Mark Sullivan sat across from their legal team. The tension in the room was thick, silence broken only by the rustle of papers. "This can't be serious," Rachel said, shaking her head. "It's very serious," replied David Collier, the network's lead attorney. "The lawsuit alleges defamation and emotional distress. Barron Trump is a private citizen. Courts take that seriously." Mark shifted in his seat. "Come on, it was a joke." "Intent doesn't always matter," Collier replied, "especially when it involves a minor." Rachel crossed her arms. "So what's the worst-case scenario?" "Financial damages and reputational damage. If Trump wins, it could limit how the media discusses public figures' families." Mark exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "What's our defense?" "We'll argue satire and free speech," Collier said. "But be careful. Until the case is resolved, avoid any comments about the Trump family. Anything you say can be used against you." Silence settled as Rachel and Mark exchanged glances. "What now?" Mark asked. "Now, we prepare for court." Meanwhile, in Trump Tower, Donald Trump sat across from Barron in the private study. "You didn't have to do this," Barron said quietly. Trump's gaze softened slightly. "I know, but this isn't just about what they said. It's about showing people there are lines you don't cross, no matter who you are. Barron nodded slowly. I get it. Trump placed a hand on his shoulder. You've handled this with more grace than most adults, but you shouldn't have to. And if I can stop this from happening to someone else, then it's worth it. Barron offered a small smile. As Trump turned back to the window, his reflection merged with the city lights. The legal battle ahead would be long, but his decision was final. No one, no matter how powerful, would insult his family without consequences. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Donald Trump entered, his steps measured and deliberate. All eyes turned toward him, but his focus never wavered. At the defendant's table sat Rachel Connor and Mark Sullivan, their confident facades noticeably strained. The air between them was thick with tension as they avoided meeting Trump's gaze. Trump took his seat beside his attorney, Charles Whitmore, who adjusted his tie and flipped open his briefcase. The judge's gavel struck, calling the court to order. Case number 24-617, Trump versus Connor and Sullivan, the clerk announced. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, addressed the courtroom. Proceed. Whitmore stood, buttoning his jacket. His voice was calm but carried weight. Your Honor, this case is about more than jokes. It's about boundaries. My client's son, Barron Trump, is not a public figure. He did not seek fame or political influence. Yet the defendants used their platform to publicly humiliate him, knowing he could not respond. This was not satire. It was a personal attack on a young man whose only crime is bearing his father's name. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but Rachel's eyes remained fixed straight ahead. We are seeking damages for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, Whitmore continued. This lawsuit is not about restricting free speech. It's about accountability. Words have consequences, especially when they target those who cannot defend themselves. With that, Whitmore returned to his seat. The judge turned toward the defense table. Counsel? David Collier stood smoothly, his gaze steady. Your Honor, while we understand the plaintiff's concerns, my client's remarks were made in the context of political commentary. Public figures and their families are subject to public scrutiny. The comments were intended as satire, not personal attacks. Whitmore immediately. Objection. Barron Trump is not a public figure. Overruled, the judge replied. Continue, Mr. Collier. Collier inclined his head. Thank you, Your Honor. Satire is protected under the First Amendment, especially when it involves matters of public interest. My clients did not act with malice. Their remarks, while perhaps in poor taste, fall within the realm of free speech. As Collier sat, the judge turned her gaze toward the plaintiff's table. Call your first witness. Whitmore stood. The plaintiff calls Donald J. Trump. Trump moving to the witness stand with a confidence that seemed to fill the room. After being sworn in, he folded his hands in his lap and faced Whitmore. Mr. Trump, Whitmore began, can you describe the impact of the defendant's comments on your son? Trump's gaze remained steady. Barron is a private young man. He didn't choose to be in the spotlight, and he's worked hard to stay out of it. When he saw those comments, mocking his upbringing, his family name, it hurt him. He asked me why grown adults would say things like that. What was I supposed to tell him? That it's okay because they think it's funny? A hush fell over the room as Trump's words hung in the air. Did you attempt to address the matter privately before filing this lawsuit? Yes, Trump replied. I reached out through my attorney, asking for a public apology. None was given. I didn't want this to end up in court, but they left me no choice. Whitmore nodded. No further questions. As Trump stepped down, the defense exchanged quick glances before Collier stood. Your Honor, the defense calls Rachel Connor. Rachel, smoothing her skirt as she approached the stand. After being sworn in, she folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders squared. Ms. Connor, Collier began, were your comments intended to cause emotional harm to Barron Trump? No, Rachel said firmly. Our show is known for political satire. We make jokes about public figures all the time. Republicans, Democrats, everyone. We didn't single Barron out to hurt him. It was about the Trump family as a whole. And did you believe your remarks were protected as free speech? Yes, Rachel replied. We have a responsibility to speak freely. If we start censoring jokes, where does it stop? Thank you, Collier said, stepping back. Whitmore instantly. Ms. Connor, would you have made the same comments if Barron Trump were an ordinary teenager without a famous last name? Rachel hesitated. Probably not. Why not? Because the context is different, she replied carefully. Exactly, Whitmore said, his voice sharp. You targeted him because of his family. You knew his last name made him vulnerable, and yet you made those comments, knowing he couldn't respond. Doesn't that suggest malice? Rachel's posture stiffened. I wasn't trying to be malicious. It was satire. Whitmore leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Ms. Connor, if someone mocked your child on national television, would you dismiss it as satire? Rachel's lips parted, but no words came. No further questions, Whitmore said, returning to his seat. The closing arguments were brief but powerful. Whitmore stood first. Your Honor, this case is about accountability. Words have power, and when those words are used to target a young man who cannot defend himself, there must be consequences. We ask the court to hold the defendants responsible for their actions. Collier next. Your Honor, the foundation of our democracy is free speech. Satire is a vital part of public discourse. While my clients regret any distress caused, their comments fall within the boundaries of protected speech. To rule otherwise would set a dangerous precedent. With that, the judge adjourned for deliberation. An hour later, the courtroom fell silent as the judge returned with the verdict. Will the defendant please rise? Rachel and Mark stood, shoulders tense. After careful deliberation, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The defendants are found liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation against Barron Trump. Rachel's breath hitched. Mark's face paled. The defendants are ordered to pay damages and issue a formal public apology to the plaintiff and his family. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck. As Donald Trump exited the courtroom, he paused beside Barron, placing a hand on his shoulder. You stood up for yourself without saying a word, Trump said softly, and today we showed the world that respect still matters. Barron nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. And as they stepped outside, the weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift. The battle was over, and they had won. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.